And welcome, Ann Morrison. This is the science blog Twiland, twiland.info. You're on usually the hour 2 on Friday on Republic Broadcasting between 1 and 2 p.m. Central. On the NutriMedical Report on Republic Broadcasting with me, Dr. Bill Deagle. We are having good streaming and no audio clipping, so everything looks great. And I want you to start off with today's show, the 16th of December, the key topics you want to talk about. We have up on the screen your information, and of course, I'd like to hear what you have to say. First off, I guess we talked about Zika virus. You can expand on anything that you talked about already. We'll, of course, have the pictures up and video of the particular issues. This is the outcome of the infant possible Zika virus infection in the U.S. Go ahead, we're all set.
Okay, well, you can scroll on down to the next one, which shows the cautionary area, Zika cautionary area, that has been designated by the CDC in Brownsville, Texas. Now, we knew that Florida and Texas would be Zika hotspots because they are both warm weather areas where the Aedes aegypti mosquito lives, and it is the Aedes aegypti mosquito that spreads Zika. So they use a yellow area to indicate a cautionary zone, and in this case it is at Brownsville, Texas. And it is, and what they're saying is cautionary in the sense that the CDC has said that the pregnant women should consider postponing travel to Brownsville. Now, Brownsville is at the very tip of Texas, right above the border. So it's the southern tip of Texas, right above the border with Mexico. And they've had 4 or 5 cases there now, and so they're doing their job. They said that when we know that there is a spread of Zika in a particular area, we will mark it in yellow on the map and let people know.
Right.
All right, I want to talk about a microtoxin, and it comes from a mold called Fusarium. And Fusarium grows in wheat when the wheat has been exposed to rain in the late stages of its growth. So after the kernels are formed, if it rains, then Fusarium will grow on the grains. And for instance, this year has been particularly hard for the provinces in Canada. In Manitoba, we have 85 or 90% of the samples have contained the Fusarium damaged kernels. And that's really bad. Saskatchewan had 80%, and Alberta has 30%. So what happens is that you cannot use Fusarium damaged kernels for food because it contains a microtoxin, and the microtoxin is called deoxynivalenol, and they abbreviate that DON. D for D, O for oxy, and N for nail ball. And it is a mycotoxin. In other words, it's produced by the fungus.
Right.
And the Russians discovered this bioweapon and used it as a bioweapon in Russia, and they had a bad crop of wheat in Russia. It was in the late 40s, and the people were so hungry that they went ahead and dried it out and ground it up and made bread out of it, and they died. So the Soviet government then went in there to see what had happened, and they were able to extract the DON from the Fusarium, and they weaponized it, and they flew it over a couple of villages, and everybody died. Now, this was before the biochemical weapons treaty, so it's okay for them, but it's not okay for anybody else. Anyway, what's happened this year in 2016 is that a significant portion of the Canada Western Amber Durum, and that's the name of a wheat, and it's used to make pasta. It may be unmarketable as a milling grade. What happens is that we sell or Canada sells this particular wheat variety to Europe, to the European Union, and then that goes into Italy and the UK and other countries, and they use it to make pasta. But if it has this DON in it, then they can't use it because it'll kill people. And so they're very stingy with accepting any wheat that has any amount of DON in it. And then Canada uses the Western Red Spring wheat as their top bread-making wheat. And both of those have a lot of this fusarium in it. And when you downgrade what the wheat can be used for, then of course the farmers can't sell it at their regular price, and some of them will get crop insurance. But it's a big economic hit because they grow the wheat and then it's ruined, and the customers want this wheat because they want to make their products, and they don't have the wheat to make their products. Now, so what do? Some of them, like in Britain, what they do is that they take the wheat that has the fusarium in it and they mix it with grain that does not, for instance, local grain to Europe or to Britain. And they might have to mix in a 5-to-1 mix or whatever it takes to get the levels down of the fusarium toxin, mycotoxin. And they thought that they wouldn't have this problem, but they did. There's really no way that you can stop the rain from falling. It was going to fall, and they can't spray fungicide on the wheat if it's within 6 weeks of being harvested, because they don't want people to be eating fungicide either. And so they're testing the wheat at the elevators, and the fusarium head blight is on the rise, and it may be related to climate change, or it might have just been this year's rain along the west coast. We've been having rain even in California. And then another thing that they're doing is they're eliminating the susceptible cultivar. Well, what is a cultivar? That's a variety. So you have, I'm sure that people are familiar with the fact that you take two different varieties of wheat and you cross-pollinate them and you get a hybrid. And if the hybrid reproduces true, it becomes a cultivar. And so there might be cultivars out there that are less susceptible to the fusarium. But they can't apply the fungicides, and don't have the cultivars out in the field because they're still studying and deciding how they're going to make them. So that's been really bad, and we had the same situation here, I think it was about 5 years ago, and I wrote a blog about is your bread safe to eat? And the answer is it might not be. So it's really important to keep track of what's going on in the farming industry. You may want to change to eating other types of carbohydrate.
Right. One of the things you mentioned that was really interesting on the show is that they're selling them to Europe, but they have to mix it with other grains from other parts of the world to bring it down to an acceptable level, let's say less than 1 part per million of this DON toxin. That to me is meddlesome because they don't really know what effect it'll be in terms of chronic low-level exposure. High exposure kills you right away. Low-level exposure might cause bowel cramps, wasting syndrome, who knows what kind of combination of symptoms of people that are exposed to this DON toxin.
Well, we do know, to some extent, the Food and Drug Administration in the 1950s, I think it was 1991, they decided that they were going to use, the administration was going to use a Fusarium oxysporum that they could use to kill the cocoa plantation in Peru. So the plants that make the beans that make the cocaine, they were going to just wipe them out with one of these microtoxins. And in 2000, a proposal was passed to use the agent as part of Plan Colombia. And if you don't remember, Plan Colombia was when we were trying to interdict the cocaine that was coming in from Colombia on the north side of South America.
Right.
And there were concerns that the use of the fungus could be perceived as biological warfare. So the Clinton administration waived this use of Fusarium. In other words, they said, well, Fusarium isn't biotoxin. And it isn't. It's the DON, the D-O-N, in it that is.
They're splitting hairs, aren't they?
So with a stroke of a pen, the president said, we're not going to classify Fusarium as a biological warfare agent. And if you look at the biological warfare agent list, you won't find Fusarium. There used to be a Fusarium. If you look at an old list, it has Fusarium on it. But now what they have is DON. And you have to know that the DON comes from Fusarium. Anyway, and then they passed a law in 2006 that they were going to test the mycoherbicide agents. Either, there were a couple of them that they were using. And so they were going to test them in field trials in Texas. And the cocoa plants from a previous outbreak had been widely cultivated. And the fungus, I don't know if you all remember this, but I remember this. There were 31 children who were born in the Rio Grande region of Texas in 1991. They were anisophalic. That is, they had no brains. Their heads were full of water.
Right.
And we had a similar situation up in Washington State in 3 counties west of the Hanford nuclear operation. And they haven't yet attributed that to the radiation that comes from Hanford, but it's very suspicious, and they're taking a lot of time to determine the cause of those anisophalic children in Washington State. Anyway, that was a terrible thing that happened, and I guess that they didn't go ahead and use it in Colombia because they would have promoted birth defects in Colombia.
Right. That's amazing, isn't it?
That is truly amazing. Now, the first thing I heard this morning when I got up was that Corpus Christi had a water problem. Well, Corpus Christi, Texas, often has a water problem because of one reason or another. And but in this case, this was different. It was caused by a poison and not a bacteria or a virus. You know, usually they tell you to boil your water. You'll have a boil water command, or they'll say filter it, or they'll say something else. But in this case, they said do not use any water that comes from your taps. And the problem was with this is that they discovered that it was the problem with the water was that it had a backflow incident in the industrial area of Corpus Christi, and gallons of chemical called indolin, AA-86, which is an asphalt emulsifier, entered the water system in a backflow incident. So they take the water in into this industrial area, and but sometimes it backflows, and so then it sends whatever the water's mixed with into the tap water. So they boiling, freezing, filtering, or any way to disinfect the water. Sometimes they tell you to put chlorine in it, will not make it safe to use. And so people had to, and they didn't hand out water. That was a strange thing. They made people go and buy their own water. But anyway, so they think that the San Antonio-based oil company Valero operates a large refinery complex, and they have a place in the city that's called Refinery Row. And I hope you have a chance to look on the blog or look on live stream and see the towers that are involved in this. And this has to do with gasification and separation of oil and gas.
That picture's up right now on the screen.
Good. And so they blamed Valero, and the city is started a suit against them. But Valero says, no. It wasn't us. What happened is, they say, is that Corpus Christi doesn't handle their own water, water that goes into the taps. They outsource it. And, of course, as happens often in outsourcing, if the person that's working in that system, in the water supply system for a city, is not an employee, then they don't get the benefits of an employee. And often outsourcing will result in a contractor who is less invested in making sure that the water supply is safe. It costs the city less because they don't have to have all those benefits for the employee, but they don't get the same level of service that they would if they had their own employees working on making sure that the water was safe.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting to see what comes of this. They have taken off. They are now allowing people to use tap water, and I think you'll see on the live stream that MSDS for this chemical, and for instance, in the emergency overview, it says danger, causes eye and skin burns, causes severe respiratory tract irritation, may cause allergic skin reaction, causes damage to the following organs: respiratory tract, skin, eye, lens, or cornea. May cause damage to the following organs: digestive system, gastrointestinal tract. Do not get in eyes or on skin or clothing. Avoid breathing vapor or mist. Dermal, so it's corrosive to the eyes, it's corrosive to the skin, it's severely irritating to the respiratory system, and it may cause burns to the mouth, throat, and stomach. So, and of course, it may cause damage to the following organs: upper respiratory tract, skin, eye, lens, or cornea, and the digestive system and the gastrointestinal tract. So, this is a poisoning, and it certainly qualifies as a mass casualty event. They don't say how many people were affected, but the city of Corpus Christi is going to have to, they're going to have to do something, because they weren't able to get potable water to the residents.
Yeah, now that fits right in with also your follow-up story you did today on the use of chemical fracking technology for the oil, to get oil independence in America. And you have a map here which I have up on EPA standard study of hydraulic fracking, fracturing of oil and gas, potential impact on drinking water. We've estimated that right now already 5% of Americans are affected by hydrofracking, putting possible biotoxins in their water supply. This shows you the distribution areas of where fracking can be done. So all these areas, they could damage the aquifer and the water supply. So both plants growing there, wild plants and agricultural plants and people, can be poisoned by chemical fracking.
Yes, this was EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency's response to Congress urging them to study the relationship between hydraulic fracturing for oil and gas and drinking water in the United States. And this request was made in the early 2000s. And this was their response. They made that map. They went out and they surveyed, and they said, well, this is where fracking is occurring. And so they have a map of the United States, and they have those sites listed. And they said, oh, yes, okay, well, drinking water could be affected. In other words, if you're withdrawing water for drinking or for hydraulic fracturing in times of low water availability, then your groundwater might be contaminated, or they might spill hydraulic fracturing fluids and chemicals, and they might even inject hydraulic fracturing fluids into wells without adequate mechanical integrity. That means the wells have holes in them.
Yeah.
And sometimes they just, they got to get rid of their hydraulic fracturing fluids, and they just put it in the groundwater.
Right.
And sometimes they spill some of their chemicals, and those run off and get into rivers or other sources of drinking water.
They also do something else that's really weird. They take one material out of one layer of rock, say in Oklahoma, and we know about a thing called frac wakes, where they put a equal amount of fluid back down, but it has different specific gravity, and they're putting it into a different rock surface. So they're increasing what's called frac wakes, where they insert the fluid back into the ground, but at a different level of the strata, and it actually induces pressure changes that cause frac-induced earthquakes in Oklahoma. And it's a big problem because we had to cut back on the amount of fracking of the ground because they're changing the pressure wave that holds the substrata of the rock together, and by changing also the specific gravity of the material they're putting down in a different form of rock formation, they're increasing risk of a major frac-induced earthquake.
Yes, the largest one I've heard about was a 5, and it was close to Oklahoma City. Now, what happens when you have a magnitude 5, which is only a medium earthquake, but it does damage the infrastructure. It'll cause breaks in natural gas pipelines, for instance,
right,
or bridges or roads. And, when the city permitted the fracking operation, they did not, in their contract, they didn't get paid to fix the infrastructure. It seems like the oil companies who are making these earthquakes should have to pay for the fixing of the infrastructure. So there's starting to be some concern about that.
That should tie to the fact they're going to be financially responsible if they trigger off frac wakes to destroy roadways, bridges, etc., or gas lines.
Exactly.
Okay, next story. Do you want to talk about your strep pyogenes infection in Alaska?
Yes. Now, we have a new streptococcus germ. There's about 200 of them, and it's group A streptococcus bacteria. And you pronounced it really well.
Streptococcus pyogenes. That's because I did bacteriology.
Pyogenes, yeah.
Pyogenes, yeah. I did bacteriology before I went into medicine.
And so they call it a gas, which means group is G, and A is A, and S is streptococcus.
Right.
So gas, and it was pyrogenes. And it was first identified in Fairbanks in July of 2016 in Anchorage, mainly among a homeless population. And at least 28 people in Fairbanks and Anchorage have been hospitalized since, and 4 have died. And this is a new strain that they've never seen before. So what happens is that if this strain has not infected humans before, there's no antibodies, there's no resistance to it. And so it just goes into the body, and our immune system doesn't know what to do with it, and it doesn't treat it as a bacteria, and people die.
It doesn't treat it as a foreign pathogen. It has a hyaluronidase, which means it dissects through tissue planes by dissolving the hyaluronic acid polymer between your cells, so it literally liquefies your tissues before it enters the tissue planes, and then literally can chew off your fingers or your whole arm or leg. So it literally dissolves the connective tissue hyaluronic acid polymer before it dissects through the tissue planes, and then literally amputates your fingers or your whole limb.
Well, actually, they go in beforehand and they amputate the arm.
Yeah, but I'm saying if you don't stop the organism, that's what it'll do.
Oh, it'll kill you. There's no doubt about it. They had to do the amputation. And 6 of the patients have developed that. And one person has lost an arm, and another person lost multiple digits. One had cellulitis, and cellulitis will kill you too. And another had toxic shock syndrome. Now, some people can be colonized by the bacteria. So that means that they're carrying it, but they're not getting sick. And so I want to warn people again that if you don't know somebody, don't let them talk to you at a distance closer than 6 feet, because they'll carry it in their saliva. And if they're closer to you than 6 feet, you're going to get that saliva in your nose or your mouth.
Wow.
And
by the way, it travels at 200 miles an hour if they cough or sneeze. It travels at 200 miles an hour if you cough or sneeze.
Cough or sneeze.
Yeah, and the reach phase can be up to 40 feet.
Yes, and I've been telling people to wear a face shield. You can see through them, that people can see you, and you can see out, and those are less intrusive than a mask, and I think they're safer too.
We should start getting the habits of the Asians, which is if you're coughing or sneezing or having an upper respiratory infection, you should wear a mask. I think it's bad public etiquette for people to not be masked if they're out in public with an infective viral infection, because some of these bugs now are going to kill people. Or they're going to do things like the strep pyogenes. It's going to make you get amputations or die of sepsis.
That's right. Now, some of the racial demographic groups are more susceptible to these types of bacteria, including Native Americans. So the cases in Alaska have been mostly middle-aged Alaska Native men with alcohol problems. And all 4 who died were Alaska Natives, and I'm assuming that means Indians.
Yeah, that's similar to what happened a couple hundred years ago when white men came and the measles epidemic in South America killed off an awful lot of the population.
That's right. That's exactly what is happening. And you have to be very careful, because until they get a treatment for it, or until they wipe it out, which is what they'll try to do with quarantining in isolation, then we're all susceptible to dying of it because we have no immune response. Okay, I want to move into radiation. And there was at 9 Mile Point, New York, and that is on Lake Huron, just at the top of what they call upstate New York. And there's 1 million people within a 50-mile radius of that. They had a scram, and they have a hot shutdown. And a hot shutdown is what Chernobyl had before it became an atom bomb and spread radiation around the world. It was a manual scram. That means that the operator injected the control rods into the power rods into the core, and they were operating at 100%, and now they have 0% power coming out. And the reason that they scrammed it, shut it down, was due to high vibrations on the main turbine. And I think we all know how these nuclear plants make electricity. Is they heat the water until it's steam, and then they send the steam to a turbine, which is turned around, spun, and in spinning it, that creates electricity, and then the water goes to where it's cooled down, and then the whole cycle starts up again. So they say that the decay heat is being removed via steam to the main condenser using bypass valves. So they're not saying that any radiation is being taken into the atmosphere, and they're trying to find out. Now we've talked about other nuclear reactors who have had scrams due to vibrations, and it seems to be a common problem. Becoming more common problem, let's put it that way. This was licensed in 1969, so a 20-year operating life would be 1989. And so it must have been relicensed by the NRC at least twice, and they're probably using high burnout fuel which is even more dangerous. So all you people that live around in upstate New York, you need to know about this, and you need to voice your opinion to the NRC.
Yeah.
Okay, should we go on to RADCON?
Yeah.
Okay. RADCON is a nuclear emergency tracking center, and they have sites around the United States, and they read not only the EPA's radiation monitors, but also personal monitors that are calibrated. And yesterday, they had 5 readings where they were concerned with the level of the reading that they were getting around the United States. And so Grand Junction, Colorado, they had a 661 counts per minute of gamma in the energy range of 600 to 800 kilo electron volts. Now, why do they measure gamma? Because alpha and beta can be stopped by a face mask and by clothing. And unless you drink it or breathe it in, it's not going to bother you. But gamma will go right through, and it's teratogenic, which means that it can change your DNA. It can cause cancer. It just cuts into you, and eventually something will stop it, and it'll get damaged. So people in Grand Junction, Colorado, you need to call your emergency management office and find out why you have such a high gamma count.
Right.
San Diego, California, is currently at 423 counts per minute, and Yuma, Arizona is at 378. Las Vegas, Nevada, and of course we might know why places in Nevada might have high gamma counts because of the nuclear test range, is currently at 231 counts per minute, which is above the average, and San Antonio, Texas has 224, which is above the average.
Yeah.
Okay, and people in those cities should contact their emergency managers and find out why you're exposed to so much gamma.
Yeah.
All right, I have some interesting, let's talk about the scientists who want to give the atmosphere an antacid to relieve climate change. People who have been watching climate change for for the last 20 years know about Plan B. And, Plan A is that we're going to stop the generation of carbon dioxide and then we'll relieve the greenhouse effect, and then the plant will go back to normal temperatures.
Right.
Plan B is what the rich do. This is their plan. They want to increase the albedo of the Earth, and let's see, they put up nanoparticles of aluminum and other metals so that would make the Earth's atmosphere reflective to the sun's rays, and so less of the sun would be coming down to the Earth and heating it up.
Right.
And we don't think much of that as an answer. But they have now, and these attempts are called geoengineering,
Right.
as a general term. And so one of them was to follow the massive dispersion of sulfur dioxide into the air during a volcanic eruption. Now, there are a few obvious problems with this approach. Nobody is going to authorize you to release sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere.
Right.
And why is that? Because sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere causes acid rain. And in the 60s, people in Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota started complaining because their trees were dying, and it was because the rain was acid, and so their livelihood was in well, it was going away, and they complained to the federals, and that was where the EPA was started, and the EPA traced their pollution from Southern California. And so they set up different districts around the country, and the South Coast Air Quality Management District became the one that I was most involved with. And they started finding out where the sources of the smog were coming from, and they had a pretty good handle on it, and in fact the air finally cleared up enough that it wasn't like living in fog all the time. And they have continually improved that system. And but they also say the sulfur dioxide eats away at the layer of ozone that protects us from ultraviolet light, and it would warm the lower part of the stratosphere above the tropics, so about 19 miles up and plus and minus 20 degrees around the equator.
Right.
But now they have a new plan B, and this is that they want to put an aerosol of calcium carbonate into the upper atmosphere. And they say it will help protect the ozone layer, which we need the ozone layer. And it's sort of like giving the atmosphere a handful of antacid tablets. It would block some incoming solar energy from the sun, and it would neutralize some of the acid particles that are bad for the ozone. So that's been proposed, and the National Research Council is looking at it, and you can certainly send in your comments on that.
Yeah, and they had what's happening, and I talked to Dr. Isley in March of '97 for a whole evening, who founded the World Constitution Parliament Association of the United Nations, and they were talking about changing the albedo of the Earth and doing carbon capture in the oceans. This idea is kind of harebrained because we're actually heading, as a panel of scientists, including Dr. Easterbrook here from Washington State, and other U.S. and Russian and other scientists from Europe and Canada, have shown that we are into a Maunder mini ice age period starting formally in about 2014, 2015. We're now deep into it, which is why we're getting these hot and cold periods, but our overall climate is shifting to a cooler climate, basically 3 to 4 or 5 degrees cooler even in the southwest United States, and increased rainfall down the southwest U.S. as we start to cool and go to a mini ice age, which will last between 75 and 90 years. It happens every 360 years on 2 cycles, where Saturn and Saturn and Jupiter line up, and what happens is it causes the same cooling period 360 years ago that made the Viking and Danish emigres to Greenland had to emigrate back to Denmark and to Iceland. So these things happened 360 years ago. There was a 4-foot ice on the Thames River in England, and they could even put ice houses out there. So what people should realize is these are natural cycles, and we're talking about changing the albedo of the Earth in the middle of an ice age. And in terms of climate change and food supply, a formal full ice age, would be more devastating to the Earth than a nuclear war in terms of population. And a mini ice age is going to stress us. So a lot of the areas where we grow, say, winter wheat, won't grow snow on the ground even in mid-July in the northern states in the next 5, 10, 20 years. So a lot of the growth areas where we can grow food are going to contract considerably, and people need to be aware of that. And we're not managing our soil very well. Our soils are dying because we're not regenerating the minerals. We're now going to have climate change, which is cooling because of this Maunder cooling period. And changing the albedo could flip us from just a Maunder period to maybe a formal full forced ice age. So I don't think that they really know what the hell they're doing, and they should definitely consider it, especially if you talk to these climate astrophysicists that say that we're actually moving into a Maunder ice age, which will moderate our climate slightly, but it's not going to be a full force ice age. But as we meddle and add other things, we might amplify the negative effects quite a bit.
Well, that's right. Greenland used to be green,
Yeah.
and when the little ice age hit, which was the 18th century.
No, it was before that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was 360 years ago when it started. It lasted for 75 to 80 years, 90 years. But it forced all the inhabitants of Greenland out of there, and also the people that were traveling back and forth from from Denmark and Norway and Scandinavia to northern Canada to talk to the Inuit. It really had a negative effect on trade there too, because if you came back with a narwhal tusk or skins and so on from those areas of the world, you're basically dynastically wealthy if you sold it to some of the kings of Europe. So, this is real serious stuff. And when we have people that don't look at proper nonlinear climate models and they leave out one or two major drivers in their nonlinear model, they're making conclusions based on inadequate data, and they're going to make dangerous decisions without proper input from other people that will raise questions that they don't want to hear, like me.
Well, rich people often have very narrow eyesight.
Well, rich people have a pseudo IQ, thinking if I'm rich, I must be smart.
Yes, exactly. That's what I was trying to say.
And the problem with that is, usually if I'm rich, it means I must have screwed over a lot of people to get rich, or I got passed on by my relatives, or I just happen to have a really good idea kind of spontaneously. But beyond that, it doesn't make you universally smart. Someone who basically has what I call a wide spectrum IQ basically is capable of asking questions in any field of territory, even if it's not their own home territory. So whether it's music or metallurgy or biology or toxicology, they ask better and better questions so that they eventually mind meld or actually absorb into their mind not just data, but a higher construct of the reality of whatever the field set of information they're trying to master. And the real smart person builds a gestalt in their brain of the super and subconcepts, and therefore can make conclusions based on logic, both inductive and deductive, and asking even more questions that put you in a state of ignorance and understanding of how ignorant you are before you become wise, which means you start to develop a better construct of the nonlinear data set you're dealing with. And the problem I see in education is they don't teach people how to think about thinking. They don't teach people how to defend a thesis, whether it's their own thesis in a social studies program or a program of science or history. And so we don't have real thinkers in our current culture. We have absorbers and regurgitators. And unfortunately, that means we have unwise people making big decisions because they're rich, powerful, or connected. It's really very, very bad.
And remember that when Iafoco erupted, 100 years ago?
Yeah.
It put so much ash out that we had a volcanic winter. In other words, there was no summer.
Right.
And there were widespread famine because you can't grow crops unless you have summer, unless you can...
You're talking about the one that happened back a couple hundred years ago around the time of the French Revolution, where a few years before the French Revolution they were starving because of volcanic ash, which also had high fluoride content to kill the crops, but also, interesting, was also radioactive.
All right, I want to go on to the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica because remember a couple of weeks ago, or maybe 3 weeks ago, we talked about mesospheric bores. And the mesospheric bore is a place in the upper atmosphere, in the mesosphere, that doesn't operate the same way that it should. I mean, they've known about these things for a long time. And now they think that they may have an idea what's causing them. And that is, they're looking at the Ross Ice Shelf. Now, I use the word that you need to know, ice shelf. It's not a glacier, it's an ice shelf. An ice shelf does not sit on top of Antarctica. An ice shelf sits on top of the ocean.
Right.
So it's like an iceberg.
Right.
And its main function is to keep the glacier from dropping off into the sea. So it protects the edge of the glacier around Antarctica. And the Ross Ice Shelf is in the Pacific side of Antarctica. Now, the Larsen Sea ice shelf is closer to South America, to Argentina, and then the Ross Ice Shelf is not. It's closer to Australia. All right, so we got the parameters, and what they did was that they found that the Ross Ice Shelf was vibrating, and so this is a vibration with a very long period, 10 10-hour period. So this is a very slow vibration. I mean,
Right.
very, very slow. And scientists, we had reported that there were mysterious waves appearing in the skies above Antarctica, and they didn't know why. And these enormous ripples occurred in the stratosphere. And they were like mountainous swells of air that rise and fall over a period of hours. Well, they went down, and they knew somehow that the Ross Ice Shelf buzzes at the same frequency. And so that what they think is that through gravitation, which reaches through space, that these vibrations are being transmitted from the ocean, from the Ross Ice Shelf, up to the mesosphere. And, of course, they'll be studying more about this. And then they say there's another piece of evidence, because the Earth rotates, and the effect of the rotation of the Earth are amplified close to the South Pole. And this is from simulations, so they don't know. And if the oscillations are too slow, the waves get swept away by the Coriolis force. As it turns out, the upper limit just happens to be around 10 hours, which was the same as the observations that they had made earlier about these waves in the mesosphere. So I thought that was interesting. Let's
Do
see.
you want me to explain the science of it?
Go ahead,
There's 5 layers of the Van Allen radiation belt. 3 of them are in the outer atmosphere of the out of 22,000 miles out, which is where the dark black night satellite is in polar orbit that's been placed there by ancient civilizations between 13 and 35,000 years ago. And it's been in polar orbit. It's 3 times larger than the U.S. International Space Station. The gravity waves coming from deep space. Right now we have the Acam, a large millimeter array, which is a gravitational telescope that reactivated after 5 years of being offline. And it picks up gravity waves coming in from a dwarf star out in the outer Oort cloud, which is 0.73 light years out. If any object, and this is a universal principle of harmonic resonance, if any object is resonant with the Earth, the Ross Ice Shelf is part of what's called the lithospheric layer, which is the final layer of the Van Allen radiation belt. The 4th layer is the ionospheric and mesospheric layers, which are charged particles in the upper atmosphere. So what you're seeing basically is gravity waves, which is Higgs boson waves that are called graviton waves. And these graviton waves actually contract and relax time-space. So you're getting time-space contraction and relaxation, and those gravity waves are being translated to objects that are harmonically resonant with it, which is the Ross Ice Shelf. That means you're getting lensing effects through the mesosphere to objects that are harmonically resonantly locked in resonance with it. And the Ross Ice Shelf means that those gravity waves could shatter the ice shelf if they hit enough resonance to build up what's called giant waves, which build on each other and can cause a resonant effect on the actual shearing force of the ice shield out there, because it's a really large one. It's almost 500,000 square kilometers. What's happening is, if the Earth gets enough resonant waves along the tectonic plates, you get what's called a lithospheric slip, where the crust of the Earth moves on the mantle, and it happens there somewhere between 750,000 to 500,000 years, where you get a fairly significant slip rather than just a little gradual crawl. Because right now there's a crawl, say, of the mantle of the Earth and the crust. Let's say in Hawaiian Islands, you see the chain of the volcanic hotspots moving as they off the coast of the current islands. But that major shift can be as slow as 1.2 to 1.3 kilometers per hour, but it can last over several months, which means the actual crust of the Earth and the orbital position of objects in space and the star charts will change, and also the positions. For example, they recently discovered from satellite photos and so on that pyramid-like objects are popping up in Antarctica, and the original maps of Antarctica go back to the 15th century. They're reconstructed from more ancient maps, show that a civilization existed in Antarctica, and that it could well be that much of Antarctica was plunged under the ice somewhere between 5,000 and 13,000 years ago, and that there was an ancient civilization on Antarctica, which is a continent that had animals and people. And in fact, off the coast of Antarctica, there's an under ocean area where it's fed by warm springs, and there's plant life there in the ocean floor, and also in the lake underneath the ice shelf. It's a pretty large, giant freshwater lake where there's other life forms. Just like if we went to visit the planet around Jupiter, what's it called, that has is a large water planet, or a planetoid, I guess a large moon that's big enough to be called a planet. And what's happening is Antarctica, for example, 8 million years ago, according to the astrophysicists, 8 million years ago, Alaska was on the equator. So the positions of the crust of the Earth on the mantle has shifted dramatically when you look at large periods of time, like tens of millions of years. It wasn't at all the same positions as we assume right now. For example, the Himalayan mountains, about somewhere around 400 or 500 million years ago, was the continent of India crashing against the Eurasia, and the Himalayan mountains were created when they were rammed up against each other, creating the highest mountains in the world, where two continents collided, and the crust of the Earth actually pushed up the mountains. So
that's right. They are not volcanic.
Non-volcanic.
Like our Rocky Mountains.
Our Rocky Mountains are volcanic mountains, but these are non-volcanic. And the Himalayan mountains are actually created by two crashing continents on the mantle of the crust of the Earth that probably moved during a pretty cataclysmic event, where the crust of the Earth actually wrinkled up, literally, as it crashed one continental lithospheric mass, hitting another one, sliding on the mantle of the Earth. Now what happens is most of the underground cities they're building in the world are mapped as torsion field gravitonic imaging, so they can see these dormant magma domes anywhere from 1.5 miles to 5 miles or more underground. And they love to build their underground cities in them. That's actually their ideal location. So you can imagine you have a 5 or 6 or 10 cubic mile size hollowed out cavern. It's easy to make a giant city inside that. Their next favorite is to make a matrix city by using sodium-cooled nuclear reactors to hit the rock face with impact lasers and tunnel it out with zero debris to create a tunnel. The ones that I know about, because I took care of some of the employees taking care of the tunneling machines back in the 90s, and I took care of Phil Schneider's friend John Fiala, who was his tunneling cohort, and they got exposed to small particle disease because of the tunneling lasers. Their air filtration system wasn't perfect, and they ended up damaging their lungs. But they actually found a tunneling system of tunnels in Baja California and in Southern California Mexican border that they estimated from analysis of the radioisotopes that these tunnels were between 300,000 and 500,000 years old, and they're made with virtually identical technology to what we have today. So civilization and or visits to Earth have been a constant thing solarly and galactically for a very long time, and the human race as we exist now is coming out of previous falls of our civilization, either the galactic, solar, or intergalactic effects of ancient wars. There's very good evidence that we are suffering and recovering from an ancient war. The situation here in Antarctica is timely because as these climate things happen, the Antarctic ice shelf is increasing, whereas the Arctic is opening up despite the fact it's cooling in Antarctica. And we're seeing these vibrations because gravity waves are the primary thing that drives the release of ringwoodite, nascent oxygen and hydrogen to generate water, which according to Northwestern University is the primary driver to create earthquakes and volcanoes, which are because the melting point of rock drops on exposure to superheated steam. And that creates all the drivers for earthquakes and volcanoes are created by nascent oxygen and hydrogen released primarily by gravity waves from deep space. Interesting, eh?
Yes. Now I want to jump down to the Larsen ice shelf.
Right.
And now, we just finished the summer. Well, they're going into summer because we're in winter.
Yeah, the Larsen one is the yellow one on the top, 48,600 kilometers. Larsen C.
Yes. Now, you remember this was the subject of the Day After Tomorrow film.
Right.
And Larsen B, so they had a Larsen A that broke off, and it created an iceberg, and it floated away. And this is also an ice shelf. An ice shelf, like I said, does not sit on land, and its main function is to keep the glacier that is on land from falling into the sea. So so in 2002, we know that there was a calving event at Larsen B, and Larsen B floated away from the ice shelf and it disintegrated eventually in the ocean, and which was close to South America, and it was in the shipping lanes for a while. So they flew over it, and the rift, now they're looking at a rift in what they're calling Larsen Sea. So A was closest to South America, and B was the one that slipped off as an iceberg in 2002. We're now at 2016, and the rift in Larsen Sea measures 300 feet wide and cuts a third of a mile deep, completely through the bottom of the ice shelf. And
so that's obviously not due to a cooling effect. It's due to a harmonic resonant effect, breaking the crystal structure of the ice.
And the rift is long, and it's growing longer, but it still does not reach across the entire shelf, and you can see a picture of that on the live stream. And when that happens, Larsen Sea will be an iceberg about the size of Delaware. Now, again, we don't expect any dramatic change in rising ocean levels because it's an ice shelf, which means that it will become an iceberg. And so only 10% of it will be sticking up out of the ocean. So we don't have to be worried about that.
Yeah.
What we're worried about is that in another 20 years, there'll be a Larsen D, and eventually the entire Larsen ice shelf will slip away from Antarctica, allowing the glaciers to slip into the ocean.
Yeah, that's interesting. And of course, during the Ice Age, what people should realize is that during the Ice Age, for example, during the people that were traveling between Scandinavia and Great Britain and so on, much of the North Sea didn't exist. And what they call them, I'm trying to remember the name of the people, the Doggerlanders they call it, that traveled between Scotland, Ireland, and so on 10,000 years ago. Much of the area that was recaptured by the sea was actually above water. So if we have a global cooling period like the Maunder one, it may actually drop the sea level slightly, and a major ice age would actually drop it dramatically.
Exactly, because the water comes up from the ocean and then it falls as snow on the land, and so it moves the water from the ocean to the land.
Right.
And so the sea level falls. Okay, I want to talk solar, and we're talking about, do you remember that Planet X or Planet 10 disappeared in the nomenclature because they decided that Pluto wasn't a planet. They don't say what it is, but it's not a planet. So they're calling this one Planet 9, and there's a nice picture of it. And this information came from the probe that NASA sent out to look at Pluto.
Right.
And all the way out there, when it was going out there, it was taking measurements of different things, and it was sending those measurements back to Earth.
Right.
And finally, the scientists have analyzed those measurements, and they say there is evidence that there is a Planet 9.
Yeah, but what they're trying to spin is the fact that it's not a planet, it's a dwarf star. And a dwarf star that actually has planetary-like objects the size of Uranus and Neptune circulating around it, and because it's in the Oort cloud, which is 0.73 light years out beyond we call the energy wave boundary zone between the outer solar system, it's shoving in hyperelliptical comets like Exciting Spring into our inner solar system that never saw the inner solar system waves. And if it's a red dwarf, these red dwarfs have roughly this size, has 200 times the magnetic flux field, but they have what's called a gravitational moment. And that gravitational moment, especially if it's lined up with other planets like the planetary alignment of Jupiter and Saturn, can have effect on inner planets' nuclear reactions, because every one of our inner planets is a nuclear reactor, and can have effect on the solar chromosphere, causing a change and shift in the energy output, which is why the sun is putting out more ultraviolet rays and X-rays and less infrared light and less visible light than it did before. So we're seeing shifts in energy output of the sun, and it changes in also gravitonic and nuclear reactions in each of the inner planets are all nuclear reactors. So those things are significant. And what they should do is not call it a planet at all. They should refer to it correctly as a captured hyperelliptical dwarf star, because only 10% of dwarf stars are entrained in a gravitational orbit between 1 and 2 stars. For example, we might have a distant cousin star that might even be dead, like a white dwarf, where this object is circulating between our star system and it. But the 73% of all stars in our galaxy are binary or trinary. And technically, Jupiter, because it puts out more infrared light and X-rays, is actually a star technically, but it's primarily a planet. But this object is a dwarf star, which means it has a strong magnetic moment, a strong gravitational moment, and it has circulating objects around it. And its primary effect is gravity waves, but it can also discharge plasma across inner solar space between it and other objects and planets and comets, which is why it can light up comets, but it can also have effects across the solar system.
Okay, well, let me
go
go on with what NASA has published.
Right.
And they have analyzed the data.
Right.
And they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 objects that are circling around the outer solar system. This doesn't mean that they ever get into the solar system that we know. It just means that, like Dr. Deagle said, there are gravitational effects.
Yeah, according to McCanny, he thinks that there could be up to hundreds of these large objects that are planet-sized in the outer Oort cloud or even beyond that just, get out there somewhere, buzz around. But this particular one has a periodicity moment somewhere between 20 and 30,000 years, so it's got a long periodicity. And when it comes back in, the ancients used to call it Herculobus, the destroyer, the devil star, the dragon star. There's all kinds of ancient mythology about it going back to ancient Sumer and Egypt, and they acted in their cartouches in Egypt to explain that they knew this. And one of the people trained to know about these star signs was Moses, who was trained as an astrologer by the high priest to replace the pharaoh, because his name Moses means drawn out of. So he was actually, even though he was adopted, was actually stationed to be the next pharaoh, and he was educated by the high priest, so he knew the astrology that the dragon star was coming back.
Okay. Now, astronomers have known for a long time that the plane of the planet that circle the sun is tilted by about 6 degrees to the equator of the sun. In other words, we don't rotate around the equator of the sun. We're tilted about 6 degrees compared to the equator.
Oh, that's really interesting.
And this discrepancy has been long known, and they didn't know what caused it. I mean, they had a lot of guesses, but now they think that from the data that they got from this probe, that this planet that is coming closer to our solar system may have tilted the other planets over the lifetime of the solar system. I mean, we're talking a long time. It didn't happen just in one pass.
Right.
But because of its strong gravitational pull, that the tilt of the 8 official planets can be explained by the gravitational influence of this Planet 9 over the 4.5 billion yearish lifetime of the solar system.
Now, an alternate question would be, did it tilt the gravitational field and pull the planets off of the ecliptic plane, or did it tilt the sun by some kind of unknown gravitational effect?
Well, they're saying that it tilted the planets.
Yeah.
Okay, so they have presented this data at a joint meeting of the American Astronomical Society Division for Planetary Sciences and the European Planetary Science Congress in Pasadena. So that's what we got out of the probe that went to Pluto. And I think it's very interesting, but you have to look at it.
That's really neat stuff, Ann, because this kind of information is important for people to realize that there's a lot more to what's going on in the solar system, and we're not in a closed system. In fact, what I think they should do is they should report space weather when they're reporting continental weather, like on CNN and major news networks like BBC News, World News, or whatever, because the problem is that solar and galactic weather affects our planet, and there's influences from gravity waves and solar and galactic particles in the galactic atmosphere. For example, we're in a part of the galaxy there's a lot more what's called primary particles, so it increases the rainfall and increases other effects that we don't usually think about. Meteorologists don't think about that space weather is locked in with our current weather, and that we're not in a vacuum.
We're not living in a vacuum. We are
Right.
part of a system that only came from the mind of God.
Yeah, exactly. It's way more cool. The 104
Okay, I
fireballs too.
I want to talk about crony capitalism. So I'm going to start with Exxon.
Ah, yeah.
The Massachusetts Attorney General has started a lawsuit against Exxon.
Right.
And Exxon went to a federal judge, and he says what they want is they want to know why the Massachusetts Attorney General is picking on them, and they want to know, and she's answering, they want her to answer questions about her climate investigation to Exxon lawyers. And and this was a federal judge, and I think I have a copy of the judgment someplace. Well, maybe I don't. Anyway, that was the judge said that the Attorney General had to submit to Exxon's written questions and appear in person for a deposition over her probe of the oil giant's climate change research.
Wow.
And he's going to determine whether bias or prejudgment influenced her decision to launch her investigation last April.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, and so the Exxon asked for an injunction blocking the Attorney General's investigation and the investigation underway in New York by the Attorney General, who has also been put on notice that he may have to appear for deposition. And both of the Attorney General said they're not going to do that. And so, but the judge upheld that. And they said Exxon had betrayed its conscientious, even baiting strategy for questioning Healy by asking her in written questions previously authorized by the judge. And this is what she has to do. State, identify, and describe the basis for your belief that investigating a single company will help combat or limit climate change. So,
well, that's good because the left should be on notice. Climate change is far more complex than what these simpletons try to make it out to be. Their basic idea is that carbon dioxide is causing greenhouse gases, but there are other more dangerous greenhouse gases, including methane hydrates that stay up in the atmosphere at least 6 months before it degrades. But that's not the primary thing. The primary effect affecting climate change is solar and galactic events like these gravity waves and natural cycles that affect the climate and the ionosphere of the Earth. The problem is that they don't have a proper nonlinear model that they're using, and they want to pick on one or two things because they want to tax them. For example, if you can link carbon to oil exploration and carbon usage for fuel for energy development, we're probably at 20 years away to 30 years away from large-scale nuclear fusion reactors to cover continents, and smaller ones to handle islands, for example, so they could have free energy. There's several problems with that. The first one is they've held back the Tier 1 science, although the Chinese now, 5 years ago, assigned 3,500 scientists to start mining helium-3 from the moon and starting tokamak fusion reactors across China. We've had the technology for 50 years. That, number one, any technology that generates heat on Earth, other than what's called a recycle technology, beyond a certain level, may start to actually heat the whole planet. So there's a potential of what I call the Venus effect, where you have limitless energy generation from fusion technology, and over a period of centuries, you actually heat the planet up to a level where it's uninhabitable. So we've got to be careful that, if we develop zero-point energy or fusion technology, we have to make sure that it's not starting to affect the entire climate. For example, large cities, just by the very reflective effect of having concrete and steel, are usually warmer than the surrounding territory because they absorb heat and re-radiate it to areas around it. And so already we know large megacities are actually usually a degree or two warmer than the surrounding territory. So There's effects that we don't see now because we don't have as large an effect. But if you have almost limitless energy from 0 point or tokamak fusion reactors, you might start seeing continental or climatic global effects from human effects that aren't due to carbon credits, but just the generation of energy itself. So we don't think about those things, but you have to ask the right questions before you start meddling and doing things. And if you do, you got to stay below threshold so the Earth can radiate that heat off, and you don't end up with a climate catastrophe a few centuries from now.
Okay, there was blowback from this win by Exxon, and they filed subpoenas,
Yeah.
against the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Rockefeller Family Fund,
Right.
and Michael Northrup, who is the director, and also some some of their climate people, the people that are
Right.
fighting for the climate, and so they have issued subpoenas, and so now ExxonMobil is engaged in a fight with several environmental advocacy groups as it demands to see their records.
Right, which is not surprising that we appointed Governor Perry, who's a 4-time Texas governor for energy, czar, and also Rex Tillerson, head of ExxonMobil, the largest corporation on earth, to head the State Department. It's not surprising that Mr. Trump appointed these gentlemen because the pitched battle is ultimately between energy and pseudo-environmentalism.
Okay, and so this is an unusual example. I mean, this has never been done before, and so the advocacy groups are trying to exercise their First Amendment rights, including the rights of free speech, to freely assemble and to petition government, and they don't want to hand over any information about who's organizing them or on what basis they are picketing Exxon.
Yeah, I think they should. Firstly, we should have an open discussion because it's like when you mentioned earlier about them putting out a public request to help them in dealing with things like any issue. The level of intelligence in the so-called academic or administrative parts of governments or regional governments or national governments compared to the intelligence of the public itself is a huge IQ gap. And the public, which includes scientists and citizen broadcasters and other people like myself, is considerably higher than the collective intelligence of the so-called academics and the even the corporate executives that want to just push their agenda. And because they can't come together except have independent people, the current mechanism should be moving toward what I call open democracy or direct democracy, because what we're seeing right now is these guys are in a big legal battle, and they're going to legalize legal battle this out, which isn't necessarily logical. With battalions of attorneys from ExxonMobil and public environmental groups, and ultimately neither side will probably, in a sense, win or prevent things that are not good. For example, if you use dirty coal in China, you're going to pollute the hell out of the climate. So when I attended a conference at the American Academy of Environmental Medicine back about 12, 13 years ago in Colorado Springs, U.S. Geological and NASA brought out data that 83% of the mercury falling on our crops in North America was mercury from dirty coal used in China. So there's a lot of unexpected effects. So if you have clean coal technology, it's not the same as I'm trying to say it's really bad to use coal. Or if you're using dirty coal, or how are you doing the gas lines, for example, the line, for example, that goes under a lake that could dirty the water for the native people up in I think North Dakota. We shouldn't allow these potential disasters to happen the same way we shouldn't allow fracking with chemicals. And there probably is a middle ground that could make sense, but when you have these two battling groups, either one or the other is going to win, and probably the consequences will be bad for all of us. So I'm concerned.
Well, let me go on with this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Quite a bit here. There was a press conference on March 30th this year. So and the subpoena are seeking records in a number of other areas, and so I'm just gonna.
Yeah, I got those up now. I have that subpoena list of the things they want to subpoena. Go ahead.
So they want to know why why the Attorney General is investigating Exxon. They want to know any communication that The advocacy groups have advocated that an attorney general initiate an investigation of Exxon. They want to know the fees or expenses paid to Al Gore. Now, Al Gore was at this Green 20 press conference in March, at the end of March, for his participation in and attendance at the news conference. They want the documents, recordings, and materials presented during a 2012 conference focused on holding the fossil fuel industry responsible for climate change, and they wanted records concerning the actual or anticipated participation of Exxon or other fossil fuel companies or trade associations in the international climate negotiations in Paris last December, and documents and communications. Now, this is really out of bounds, I think, concerning fundraising for candidates for political office, including fundraising for any member of the Attorney General Coalition. So they're on a fishing expedition. They want to know who's after them.
Well, they're going to ask for the sky, obviously. And this shows you that they're seriously realize that there's going to be winners and losers in this. And to be honest with you, because we don't have tokamak fusion and other energy technologies right now, or really efficient wind or solar, which could, by the way, be developed, but again, remember, if you make things too efficient, you kind of kill your own industry. For example, I was looking at technology a few years ago that was researched in Israel, and they have a technology for solar capturing and using a parabolic mirror and using a new type of collector conversion thing that's far more efficient than the current solar panels that we have. And it not only heats up water, but it also generates superheated steam for a steam turbine, but it also could raise electricity. And some of these other technologies are actually better, including wind technology, than the current ones being used. But it's almost like they don't want to advance the technology, even alternative energy. And I'm concerned that a lot of nation states, for example, that get hampered by climate change and international carbon credits, that they'll never develop industry because they won't be able to have the energy or agriculture to actually, harvest crops. And of course, the cost of energy is a major hamper to the world economy getting going again. So here in America, if we become energy independent, which I'm pretty sure Trump is going to do, because, for example, we have one seam of coal up in Wyoming that's the highest anthracite coal on the planet. And that one seam of coal in Wyoming that goes out to a park there could supply coal energy for the entire planet for somewhere around 250,000 years. Just the one seam. Not even talking about oil and gas or fracking or anything. So, we have one field in Liberty Field up in north of Alaska, out in Prudhoe Bay, that has more oil than the entire Middle East by several hundred times. And then we've got the oil tar sands up between Saskatchewan, North Dakota, and Alberta. And that one tar sands has 200 times the proven oil reserves of the planet. Just the one area. So that doesn't include Turner Valley in Alberta or other fields like the other fields right here in North America. And most of them recharge. For example, I took one of my patients was an oil executive when I was practicing in Denver. And he traveled around the country for years, and he was at that time retired. But he said he'd go back to the wells, and after the wells were capped off, 5 and 10 years, you come back and the well was fully full again. So you go to some rancher's yard in the back of Panhandle of Texas or Oklahoma, and you figure the well was dry, and you go back and test it, and say, oh my gosh, it's full again. So, a lot of this stuff has been, for 4 or 5 generations, been scammed by people that want us to buy oil at high cost to Saudi Arabia because it's tied to international geopolitical policy. High quality, expensive oil from Saudi at the cost of trillions of dollars, which harms our economy because it's part of our political process of the Middle East. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. They don't really realize that we probably should be paying like 13 cents a gallon for gasoline. And if energy was really cheap, basically no industry would leave America because the greatest cost for building anything is energy. And if you can control the cost of healthcare, which I have a plan for that I'm trying to get through to Bart Goldberg, the co-president and founder of the A4M, that's a personal friend of Donald Trump for 35 plus years, I don't see that America has anything that will shackle us from becoming the president superpower of Earth. But we can also be examples to other people to not do what I call polluting when we generate energy, or doing things that are dangerous that are generating earthquakes like frac quakes. And at the same time, we should start bringing on technology like fusion reactors, but we've got to be careful that it doesn't harm our climate model. And we also, while we're doing this, we have to stop polluting. For example, these reactors like the ones in Fukushima Daiichi, there was a company in North Dakota that offered to supply liquid natural gas up in the frac fields in North Dakota, and the Obama administration directly interfered with it. They had a contract where they were trying to give super good rates, so all the nuclear reactors in China, and there's 55 reactor sites, could all be converted to LNG, and we'd ship it out through our rail lines and gas lines out through the big ships. And Japan would be completely off of nuclear reactors and switch them all to LNG reactors, liquid natural gas. And because the danger is these reactors are generating radiotoxins that get in the upper atmosphere, and they affect the ozone layer. We know that some of the radiotoxins, one of the things they do is they chew away at it, like when they release radioiodine and argon. And these gases, when they're released from these dying reactors, they're toxic to our ozone layer, which could be very dangerous. And so there's a lot more factors involved here. We need to realize that fusion technology, as Einstein said, to boil water with the fusion of nuclear isotopes is a pretty stupid thing to do. And, that's Albert Einstein, who was the father of the special and general theory of relativity. And I understood that Einstein could talk to almost anybody, and he would say it in a communicative strategy that was, how can I say this? He could talk to the general average man and explain something in complex quantum mechanics in a way that the average person with grade 8 could understand. So, I'm hoping to aspire to that, because sometimes they get too technical. But what I'm very concerned about is the lack of intellect, lack of honesty, and the lack of humility, that they don't realize how ignorant they are when they're playing with fire or not finding real solutions. And I'm concerned about the legal battle between big groups like Exxon, that's the largest corporation on earth, and environmental groups, each digging in their heels, and both are wrong. Both people that think, for Exxon, and I'm going to use the example of Exxon, the Aceh Indonesian earthquake and tsunami was a subduction fault zone slip, where this ocean floor rose somewhere around, something like 800, 900 meters, because they were putting the wrong specific gravity material into the different plates where they're pumping out oil from the ocean floor. And when that ocean floor fell in one place and rose in another, it created like a big, what I call piston-like effect, and created a tsunami that killed 250,000 people. So most people don't realize that there were probably warning signs that you don't put down material of a different specific gravity in a different rock layer, just like in Oklahoma City. And ExxonMobil was directly involved with creating that disaster. And it's a lack of honesty and scientific rigor that creates things like that are, they quote, unexpected, because they never ask the questions to wonder if the unexpected could be realistically happen when you do things that are not natural to the environment.
Dr. Deagle, I think we've come to the end of this.
Yeah. That's pretty interesting stuff, isn't it? Your stuff about ExxonMobil, what do you think about the idea that maybe both are going to cause, are digging their heels in, and we're going to have an issue, right?
Well, this was just so unprecedented. I haven't formed an opinion. I'm just reporting what's happening.
Yeah, but I think it's important because the environmental groups have a point, like in the water supply up in North Dakota, but also ExxonMobil has done things in the past that we need to be concerned about, that because they're so big and powerful, they may push through things that may not make sense. For example, the Trump administration is very much for fracking, but if they hydrofrack with chemicals, it's going to destroy the water tables and the aquifers and poison water supplies. So I'm not against the idea of fracking as long as it doesn't either generate earthquakes or destroy the water supply and poison them. But they need to use a little bit more sense than just plowing ahead. Right?
All right, Dr. Deagle.
You did a great job today, Ann. It's amazing as always. I'll have this posted up. It'll be immediately on our live stream, and we'll have it over on YouTube and Vimeo. You did a remarkable job as always, and I want people to thank you every week by donating to your website, twiland.info, and listening regularly, and getting them to listen to the radio show too, an hour or two on Fridays. Thank you, Ann. Take care.